This is chapter 2. This is section 2.1, graphing linear equations. Okay, so first let's go ahead and get some definitions. So a linear equation is an equation whose graph is a straight line. That's actually where the word linear comes from. So I'm going to take my highlighter and I'm going to go ahead and highlight the word line in linear, right? So we called it a linear equation because when we go to graph it, it makes a straight line. Solutions to a linear equation are the points which lie on the line. So any point that lands on the line that we draw is a solution, okay? You can pause the video if you need some time to write this down, but we're gonna go ahead and move on. So first off, let's look at the steps for graphing a linear equation. So if we're graphing, the first thing we want to do, and this is true for any equation that we do, anytime we start off graphing, we always want to make some kind of table, okay? So we're going to make a table, and then we're going to assign our choice of x values. So every time that we make a table, we just pick what x values we want. For argument's sake, most of these we're going to assign -1, 0, and 1. So we're going to check and see what happens when x equals -1, then x equals 0, then x equals 1. Okay, once we've assigned what x values we want to look at, we are going to solve for each x value to find the y value. Okay, so we're going to find the y value for each of these x values. And then finally, we're going to graph each point found, and we're going to have 2 to 3 points that we're going to put on our graph. For today, we're going to just be focusing on having 3 points, but for the future, after this lesson, we're going to start going down to only using 2 points, okay? So for today, we're just going to do 3, just to make it easy, okay? So let's start with example A. So example A, if I want to graph the equation y equals x plus 1, I'm going to go through my steps, okay? So my first step is to draw a table. So I'm just focused on this one first. And I'm going to label what x values I want to look for. So I'm just going to go in order. I'm going to make it pretty easy. I'm going to first check a negative number, which is -1, then 0, then a positive number, 1. Usually I try and make these two numbers opposite numbers that I'm checking, okay? Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these values, I'm going to take my equation, and I'm going to plug in that x value. So notice that we replaced x with a -1, and then I solved to get my y value. So for this one, I solved and got 0. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in 0 for my y value. Then next, we're going to plug in 0. We plug in 0, add 1, and we get 1. So that's my y value when x equals 0. And then I plug in 1. 1 plus 1 equals 2. And if you're wondering, how did I come up with these numbers right here? Once again, I just picked the numbers that I thought would be the easiest to check. You can check any numbers you want, right? You probably don't want to pick a really crazy high number like 112, right? Because then you got to make a graph that includes the number 112 on it. It's easier to just pick really small, easy to work with numbers, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and graph each of these points. So notice I'm going to take each of these points, I'm going to put them on the graph. So I need to graph -1, 0, okay? I need to graph 0, 1, and then I need to graph 1, 2. So note that this is my x-axis, and this is my y-axis. So when I'm plotting these points, I'm going to go into the -1 for my x value, right? Because these are my x values. These are my y values. So first off, let's go ahead and go to -1 for my x, so -1, and then 0 for my y, so I don't go anywhere for my y. So I go ahead and put a point down at -1, 0. Next, I do 0, 1, so I don't move anywhere for x value, but for my y value, I go up 1. Okay, so there's 0, 1. And then finally, I've got 1, 2. So I go 1 for my x value and up 2 for my y value. And you should have, between these 3 points, you should have something that will make a straight line when you connect them. So I'm going to take out a ruler, and I'm going to go ahead and connect these 3 points. Okay? So when I connect these 3 points, if you did not get a straight line when you connected them, then you did something wrong, right? So notice this meets our criteria. Linear equation makes a straight line. Okay? So that's how we do number 1. Let's go ahead and do another example. Example B. Okay, example B. Now we're dealing with a -2 in front, so this is a little bit harder of an equation to try and calculate, but let's just go through each step, okay? So looking at my table first, let's fill out our table. I'm just going to do the same thing I did before and just pick as easy of numbers as I can think of. -1, 0, and 1. So when I solve, I plug in -1 for x. -2 times -1 makes 2. So I get 2 plus 1, and 2 plus 1 makes 3. Okay, so I plug in 3 for my y value here. I move on to the next one. -2 times 0 makes 0, plus 1 makes 1. So I put 1 for my y value. Okay, next one, -2 times 1 is -2, plus 1 equals -1. So now I've got 1, -1. Let's go ahead and plot those. So I want to plot -1, 3, 0, 1, and 1, -1. Okay? So -1, 3. So I end up with the point right here, right where I wrote the word graph. So that was kind of my bad. 0, 1. So I put point right here at 0, 1. And then 1, -1. 1, -1. Okay? And notice that when you connect them, you should be getting a straight line. And it looks like we do. Okay? That one's done. Let's move on to another example. So this next example is kind of a strange one. We're going to look at example C right here. In fact, let me go ahead and put another paper on top. That way we're not looking at information from our last example. Okay? So we're just focused in on example C right now. Okay? Let me move some stuff so it looks nicer. Okay, so here's example C. So example C is y equals -3. So now we have to ask the question, what happens if I don't have an x value? Well, let's see what happens. So let's just pick our normal x values, -1, 0, and 1, and then let's evaluate. So when I go to solve and I plug in -1 for x, well, I don't have an x value, so I can't plug anything in. So what's true is y still equals -3. Didn't change anything. Okay, let's try it again for 0 now. Well, can't plug anything in for 0, so the answer is still -3. You should start to see a pattern here. Basically, what you're supposed to discover is no matter what you plug in for x, your answer is always going to be -3 for y. So let's go ahead and plot that. So these could have been any x values on the spectrum, right? Could have been -100, could have been 3,000, doesn't matter. I would have gotten -3 for my y value. But let's go ahead and plot this. So -1, -3, 0, -3, and 1, -3. Okay? So -1, -3, 0, -3, and 1, -3. Okay, interesting. So now I put my ruler down, and what's cool is I actually still get a straight line. Even though this problem is kind of weird, right? So right there is my answer. So something I want you to note about this is that when you have y equals something, when you have y equals, your answer or your line is always just going to be horizontal. Okay? And this is when y equals some number. Okay? Whatever that number is equal to, that's where we're putting down our line. So if I get y equals -3, I'm going to put a line down at -3 on my y. And notice, no matter where I'm at on this line, I could come all the way out here. If this line kept going, y would still be equal to -3, right? So that's what this line is telling me. It's every answer where y equals -3. Okay? Let's see what happens, for example, D, which is the next one, where x equals 2. Okay, let's see if we can do this one. Let me go ahead and move this. Okay, so for this one, it's kind of the same story. X is always going to be equal to 2. So when I go to fill out my table, problem is I can't actually put -1 because x will never be equal to -1. It'll never be equal to 0, and it'll never be equal to 1. So x always has to be equal to 2. So then I have to ask the question, if x always equals 2, what's my y value? Well, it's the same thing as before. I can pick any y value and it doesn't change the answer. So literally, my answer could be anything. I have an infinite number of numbers that I can plug in, I can put as my y value. So what's that going to look like when we're graphed over here? Well, if this was horizontal, if our last example was horizontal, we can kind of guess what our answer is going to be over here. Oops, 2, -1, 2, 0, and 2, 1. So let's go ahead and plot those. I'm actually going to stop the video now, and we're going to have a part 2. So go ahead and go to part 2 to see what happens here.